Okay, a pleasant good afternoon to everyone. And today we'll be looking at metabolism and endocrine control, something that is very important, as is really all the other processes in the body. Now, in terms of the fate of nutrients, when we look at this image here, we are seeing that the question is being asked, why isn't Lizzie growing? Because Lizzie is taking in her nutrients in the form of what that looks like a power bar. And of course, we're not seeing any growth. So very importantly, Lizzie's high energy needs diverts all of her nutrient from growth to ATP production. All right. So in terms of that, which is usually associated with the growth of a person as it relates to height, this is being passed on in terms of towards the region associated with ATP generation. So that, of course, could result in, as shown in this case, the stunting of the growth. Now, ATP synthesis uses energy from nutrient bonds. ATP breakdown liberates this energy for cellular use. So let me ask this question. If Lizzie stops eating entirely, will she stop producing ATP? Okay, we'll pause, and the answer is no, of course. Of course, that would not be the case, because notwithstanding the body, the wonderful machine that it is, it not only relies on nutrients which are taken in, but it could also generate ATP from fat stores. So that is very important. So in terms of the high energy phosphate groups, which can be directly transferred from a metabolic intermediate to an ADP molecule generating ATP. So when we're looking at the metabolic intermediate here, what we are seeing is that it has a phosphate bond, and that phosphate bond could then be added to adenine diphosphate to create that high energy bond associated with adenine, or sometimes we say adenine triphosphate. Adenine triphosphate being that unit or currency of energy used in the human body and could be used throughout the entire body. I like to refer to it very similar to a Lynx card. So very similarly, how you could use a Lynx card at Royal Castle. You can also use a Lynx card at Rattan's to go and get whatever you need. And it's the same card. You don't need a specific Rattan Lynx card, or you don't need a specific Royal Castle Lynx card. So in a very similar way, you could use the ATP that is generated universally or throughout the entire body. Additionally, so this is direct ATP synthesis from ADP using this metabolic intermediate, which is taken in. Additionally, this metabolic intermediate could have a hydrogen bond, and this hydrogen bond could be picked up by NAD, nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. And NAD is a cofactor which is central to metabolism. And in metabolism, it is very important in terms of redox reactions. So as seen here, NAD picks up the hydrogen, so now it becomes NADH. And this is used in redox reactions, very important. All right, so very important to remember nutrients provide the energy to convert ADP into ATP, which is why we eat. We eat food to really get those energy-rich bonds, which are then converted or transferred to ADP, adenosine diphosphate, to give that energy-rich bonds associated with adenosine triphosphate. This energy is transmitted through hydrogen atoms and their electrons. Let's see a little more detail on that. Now, glycolysis refers to the breakdown of glucose. Within the cell itself, the majority of the reactions associated with, or the first part of the reactions associated with the generation of pyruvate from glucose, this occurs within the cytoplasm of the cell itself. Let's have a look and see what's happening. So the first thing, glucose is broken down into two pyruvates, and this generates two ATPs and two NADHs. All right, very important there. In subsequent stages, the mitochondria, so very importantly, with glycolysis, glucose is broken down to pyruvate. This pyruvate is shuttled into the mitochondria, where oxidative phosphorylation occurs and where hydrogen is used as the ultimate acceptor of electrons. And during this process, ATP is generated within the mitochondria. And in essence, that's one of the major reasons why we take in food. We do take it in to break it down in order to generate ATP. ATP, that singular currency that is used for energy throughout the body. Let me ask another question. So what happens to the NAD plus molecule generated when pyruvate is converted into lactic acid? And of course, the answer will be, it could be used again. So in other words, it is recycled. All right. So again, what we're looking at here, the acetyl coenzyme synthesis and the citric acid cycle, very importantly. And this, of course, takes place within the mitochondria. So the pyruvate, which is generated in the cytoplasm from the first part of glycolysis, the pyruvate is shuttled into the mitochondria. And it goes through successive reactions. The pyruvate converted to acetyl coenzyme A, and then the acetyl group is ushered into this cycle, the citric acid cycle, in which you have NADH being generated and, of course, ATP. So critical, these reactions occur within the mitochondria. So very important to note when you're thinking about glycolysis, breakdown of glucose to generate energy, two parts coming to mind. One, the first part occurs within the cytoplasm. The second part involving the reorganization of the molecules associated with pyruvate, and then, of course, the citric acid cycle. This happens within the mitochondria itself. So I have another question. So remember that each glucose molecule generates 2 pyruvate as you go down. So how many NADH, FADH, 2, and ATP molecules are generated from a single glucose molecule in the citric acid cycle alone? And the answer is 6 NADH, 2 FADH2s, and of course, 2 ATP molecules. Okay, so this is just points. So how is it then that this NADH, how is it able, both the NADH and the FADH2, which they both contain hydrogen, how is that able to now generate ATP? So that's a very important question to ask. How is ATP generated? Well, let's have a look and see what's happening here. So within, this is the outer mitochondrial space. And what you see happening here, hydrogen from the NADH and the FADH2, by active transport, it is shuttled to the within this region here. So what you have happening is you have a hydrogen gradient being set up. We have a higher concentration of hydrogen ions in this region between the inner and outer mitochondrial membranes. This hydrogen, then, because of a concentration gradient, hydrogen is favored to enter through this particular protein known as ATP synthase. And as the name implies, ATP synthase, as the hydrogen passes through, it causes the coupling of phosphate to ADP, causing the formation of adenosine triphosphate. It is hydrogen ultimately becomes the acceptor of this low energy electron, and this forms water. So very importantly, in terms of the process which occurs within the mitochondria, it is the movement of the hydrogens from the NADH and FADH2 critically through this protein ATP synthase that allows the coupling or synthesis of adenosine triphosphate. And that is very important. Let's see what happens next. So in terms of the summary of what we are looking at, in terms of the breakdown of carbohydrates, or glucose to be specific, the carbohydrate is broken down by the process of glycolysis. Also, you do have fatty acid and amino acids could actually filter into this same pathway. So when you do have them filtering in, of course, this is the portion that occurs within the mitochondria and ultimately leading, most critically, to the generation of ATP. All right, so that is very important. Citric acid cycle and oxidative phosphorylation, which occurs oxidative phosphorylation, citric acid, TCA cycle, glycolysis occurring in the cytoplasm, oxidative phosphorylation within the mitochondria, ultimately leading to the generation of ATP. And that is the major reason why we eat food. So we've looked at the ATP generation. Let's now look and see the importance of that largest organ by mass in the body, the liver. So very importantly, the liver, it has a number of functions as we see here. Is very important in terms of ATP for the manufacture of ATP. Additionally, the liver itself is a storage of fats, triglycerides. They are stored, and these triglycerides as well, they could be combined with apoproteins to give lipoproteins. Additionally, free fatty acids, which are formed by the, in terms of, which are formed by the liver, they could be converted into cholesterol, and this cholesterol is critical for the formation of bile, or they could combine with apoproteins to give lipoproteins. In addition, ketone bodies, very important in terms of when we look at the role as its critical role in the body itself. But ketone bodies are also produced within the liver, and it does have a key role. Additionally, free fatty acids do combine with albumin, albumin being that carrier protein within the body. It's like the maxi-taxi of the human body, as it, if you were to look at it that way. Albumin, it's a carrier protein. All right, so one of the things that I just want to revisit in terms, well, I didn't clarify perhaps sufficiently, the ketone bodies, these could be used as an energy source during starvation because it can be metabolized in peripheral tissues, all peripheral tissues, it could be metabolized, except of course the brain. All right, so that's another important role of the liver in terms of lipid metabolism. Okay, so carbohydrate metabolism in terms of the importance from the liver. Let's have a look. So liver converts some of the sugars, fructose, galactose, sugars and carbohydrates, fructose, galactose, and glucose. It does convert them, and they either make or breaks down glycogen. So very importantly, glycogen, by glycogenolysis, it breaks it down, or you could have it's made by glycogenesis or broken down. The lysis means to cut. Genesis means, of course, initiation. So by glycogenesis, you have formation of glycogen, and by glycogenolysis, you have the formation here, right? So its breakdown product is shown here. So the liver makes or breaks down this glycogen that is important. So the glucose that is manufactured as a result of this process, excess amounts could be converted into fatty acids. And we just looked at the role of fatty acids in terms of what happens within the liver itself. Additionally, the liver releases enough glucose to maintain homeostasis. Remember, homeostasis is very important in terms of the internal temperature, in terms of pH, that these things are maintained, just two parameters of numerous ones associated with the body. So that is important where glucose is concerned. And very importantly, body tissues take up and use glucose for energy. We all know C6H12O6, glucose plus oxygen gives you carbon dioxide, water, and most critically, ATP. And this ATP can then be used for muscle contraction. So I have a question here. Does glycogenolysis increase or decrease blood glucose concentration? All right, so glycogenolysis, does it increase or decrease? And what happens in glycogenolysis? You're breaking down glycogen. So most critically, when it breaks down glycogen, what the breakdown product is glucose. So in this case, the answer will be increase. All right, so protein metabolism. So the liver itself could synthesize proteins directly from the amino acids consumed in the diet. Additionally, protein catabolism could occur. One, you could have transamination, in which the amino groups are transferred to keto acids. And additionally, these amino groups could be converted to urea, which is then excreted in the kidneys. Additionally, the carbon skeleton from these amino acids, do remember they have a carbon skeleton associated with them. They could be used for change these amino acids in food so that they can be used to produce energy. so they could be rearranged to produce energy. Additionally, carbohydrates, they could be used to make glucose, and also they could also be used for making fats and fatty acids. All right. So in terms of this food intake, we mentioned the importance of food in terms of an energy source. It is used within the body. The liver uses it to synthesize energy and other processes. And we looked at glycolysis and also the role of the mitochondria in generating ATP as well. So these were some of the things which were examined. So let's see how it's regulated. So an empty stomach produces ghrelin, and this ghrelin, blood ghrelin levels concentration, they rise when your stomach is empty. So this stimulates hunger, and the hypothalamus then dictates this eating process, right? So very importantly, hypothalamus regulates ghrelin levels, and once it sees it is high, it facilitates then the need for one to fill your stomach. So in other words, you got this hunger pangs. So then what is done, food begins to fill the stomach. So this ghrelin initiates the hunger, and CCK, cholecystokinin and protein YY family proteins, they inhibit the hunger. Leptin governs the appetite over the long term, and we'll be looking more at this in the subsequent slide. So here we see CCK and PYY, protein YY, inhibits the hunger. So while it is then that you do have these hormones released into the blood itself, CCK and PYY, of course, once your stomach is full, these are released, and it gives or sends a signal of satiety to the brain. In other words, tells the brain that you are filled. So now CCK and PYY inhibits the hunger process, or pangs as it were, and so eating stops. So that is very important. Additionally, you have, in terms of relating to the fat stores, of course, once you are hunger, in terms of regulation of food intake, for excessive periods, fat stores increase. Now, and of course, when the fat stores increase, leptin production rises. When leptin production rises, the need or the feeling of hunger is reduced. And when you have reduced food intake, what happens is food stores begin to decrease, because you're now using these food stores to break down these food stores to produce your energy. So all of these are mechanisms within the body as it relates to food storage and food metabolism. Let's talk about heat transfer. All right, so here is someone on the beach. And of course, when you're too hot, it's very important that you cool down. Why is that important? We did mention that in terms of for the maintenance of the constant internal environment, homeostasis, that is done so that your inner core remains at a nice temperature, approximately 37 degrees Celsius. It is very important that you maintain these homeostatic levels such that the reactions associated with metabolism could occur. So therefore, once you go outside of that range, it could be problematic, because now you'd have certain enzymes would govern reactions. They will not be able to function, and this will lead to a cascade or a domino effect, leading to shutdown of different metabolic pathways, leading to a disruption or a disharmony within the entire human. So that is one of the major reasons why homeostasis maintains the body at a particular temperature. And once you fall outside of that range, adjustments are made such that you return to that temperature. Let's see some of those adjustments. So in terms of the sun radiation coming in, the body itself, when it picks up too much heat, it could also lose heat via your radiation. It could also lose heat in terms of conduction, right? You could lose heat from the body. And then, of course, convection in terms of wind passing over the surface and removing that heat. And of course, evaporation. Latent heat is used to evaporate the sweat, and that is another way in which energy is lost. In terms of thermoregulation, of course, here we're seeing a young girl. She looks a little bit cold. So under cold conditions, physiological and behavioral responses limit heat loss and generate additional metabolic heat. So under hot conditions, however, so this is cold and this is hot, sweating and peripheral vasodilations, the expansion of blood vessels close to the skin occurs, and it helps the body to shed the metabolic heat and heat absorbed from solar radiation. All right, so those are mechanisms by which the body maintains its constant internal temperature. Let's speak a little bit more to the endocrine system. So the endocrine system, right, this refers, it's a ductless system in which chemical messengers are released directly into the blood system. Now, organs of the endocrine system are glands which release their secretions directly into the bloodstream. And what are these secretions called? They, of course, are called hormones. And let's look at some of those glands. We have the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, which is the master gland. We'll be seeing this in a little bit. The thyroid gland is very important as it relates to growth. The adrenal gland, also important as well in terms of the secretion of adrenaline and noradrenaline. And here we have the gonads, important for the release of that hormone testosterone in males, estrogen in females. Let's talk about the pancreas. So now each pancreatic islet, they contain alpha and beta cells. So here we see the alpha, excuse me, and here we see the beta cells. So the question I would ask, which hormone do beta cells secrete? What would you say on that one? Right, so we have the alpha and the beta cells. The alpha cells secrete glucagon, and the beta cells secrete insulin. And when we look at this alpha and beta cells, it's often nice to think about them as I like to call them the yin and yang twins, because they act in opposition of each other in terms of their functionality. Let's have a look and see specifically what do they do. So when we look at the pancreas, this is just showing us a micrograph of a pancreatic islet. We see then in one islet here, this is one islet, you have alpha and beta cells. You have numerous of them there. So what do insulin and glucagon do? The alpha cells, in terms of what they do, here we see alpha cells, right? So let's start from up here, low blood glucose level or concentration. Here for the alpha cells, right? Secrete glucagon, and this stimulates glycogen breakdown, glucose synthesis, and ketone synthesis in the liver. All of this, of course, leads to increased blood glucose concentration, so it corrects this deficit. And in terms of on the opposite side, right, if you have a high blood glucose concentration, you need to get the blood glucose down by getting that glucose out of the blood. So therefore, the beta cells in the pancreas secrete insulin that stimulates glucose uptake. And this, of course, leads to decreased blood glucose concentration. So therefore, this whole process has been corrected. This is very important to show. And this is means in terms of how the body regulates insulin, how the body regulates blood sugar levels, right? When your blood sugar levels are too high, insulin is secreted by the beta cells, leading to a decrease or an uptake of sugar from the blood itself, leading to an overall decrease or return to normal levels. Conversely, in terms of when your blood sugar levels are too low, in terms of increasing it, the alpha cells secrete glucagon, and this leads to synthesis of glucose or ketones or glycogen breakdown, which ultimately increases blood glucose concentration. Beta cells, alpha cells, glucagon, increase blood glucose. Beta cells, insulin, decrease blood glucose. Hence the yin and yang. like on opposite sides of a seesaw, how they regulate it. All right, so at your leisure, do have a look at this in terms of case of Santo S, and we'll be doing this as a exercise later on. All right, so the pituitary gland, also known as the master gland, and where is it located? Is located, as seen here, within the sphenoid bone. Consists of two major parts, the anterior and posterior pituitary gland. I have a question. What structure connects the hypothalamus with the pituitary gland? And of course, that answer will be the pituitary stalk. There's the hypothalamus, and here it is, the pituitary stalk. So in terms of the pituitary gland, very important, master gland controls the regulation of all the other glands within the body itself. Very important to note. I just point this out here, the posterior pituitary gland right around here, we see that we do have the secretion from this area, or the regulation of both oxytocin and ADH, antidiuretic hormone. Oxytocin, very important for the letdown or drawdown of milk in the breast, and also for the regulation of uterine contractions during pregnancy. Antidiuretic hormone, of course, this is important as it relates to water retention in the body itself. All right. Okay, so this is showing from in terms of the anterior pituitary, in terms of the releasing hormones, which are then sent to these specific glands. So you have FSH and LH going respectively to the testes and ovaries, prolactin, as I mentioned before, to the breast, leading to the drawdown of, leading to the ejection of milk or milk production. And then you have adenocorticotrophin or ACTH on the adrenal gland or the adrenal cortex on the kidney itself. You have thyroid stimulating hormone and growth hormone. So those are very important in terms of the classes of anterior pituitary hormones. All right. All right, so the adrenal glands. So the adrenal glands, they sit on top of the kidneys, and the cortex surrounds the inner adrenal medulla. The three regions of the gland shown here secrete three different steroid hormones. And what family of hormones is secreted from the region closest to the medulla? And that answer, of course, will be the androgens. So if we were to look at the adrenal glands, the medulla is an extension of the autonomic nervous system. It secretes epinephrine, adrenaline, and norepinephrine, right? And the adrenal medullary hormones enhance the fight or flight response. So adrenaline and noradrenaline, adrenaline very important in terms of that fight or flight response. And this is something that was a vestige of ancient times. So once you are cornered, how do you get away? So certain things occur within the body itself to get you ready to either fight off your invaders or to run. So this would include movement of dilation of the pupils, taking as much light as possible so you're looking around, getting the muscles or ready for contraction because you would need them either to run or fight. So these are two of them, and of course, increase in heart rate. So this, of course, is getting blood around the body, distributing the sugars so that you could have muscle contraction, either to fight or flight. So that is very important there. The adrenal cortex, they secrete glucocorticoids, androgens, and mineral corticoids, including, of course, aldosterone. Now, cortisol. So what is the effects of cortisol? Now, this affects glucose regulation by stimulating the hepatic glucose and ketone synthesis and making nutrients available by stimulating tissue breakdown. Cortisol also inhibits immune system activity and inhibits the inflammatory reactions. That's very important in terms of cortisol, a steroid. All right, so this is just showing the production or the steps going through in terms of the formation of cortisol. And when we see here, when it reaches cortisol here, in terms of what the effects it causes, it leads to increased tissue breakdown, glucose ketone synthesis, and also decreased immune activity. So I have a question. So does cortisol stimulate or inhibit ACTH secretion? And of course, the answer is inhibits in a classic homeostatic negative feedback loop. Increased blood cortisol suppresses output of the hypothalamic CRH and pituitary ACTH. Okay, so excessive cortisol production. Now, usually all of these things, they're regulated on a by a homeostatic mechanism, but sometimes you do have excess cortisol production. And in certain cases, it could lead to a certain syndrome or a certain associated things which can be seen in the individual. Let's have a look at this. And one of these syndromes is Cushing syndrome. And it could be promoted by hyperplasia or tumor of the pituitary gland, hyperplasia or tumor of the adrenal cortex, and medicinal or medical treatment with cortisol or related drugs. And here is an example of hypercortisolism in terms of some of the structures which are associated with it. One, have a moon face in terms of rounding, buffalo hump, truncal obesity, increased facial hair, thin extremities, and of course, thinning scalp hair. All of these are associated with hypercortisolism. Thyroid gland, all right, very important, as seen here. And when we do have issues related to the thyroid gland, it could manifest itself in this form, which is known as a goiter. And important to note, while we don't see goiters very often these days, goiters could also be associated with a decrease or a lack of iodine in the diet. So one of the things which is often done to one of the more important things which we use on a daily basis, salt, is that iodine is added to salt. So if we were to look on the labels of most of the salt we buy, we would see that it's sold as iodized salt. And one of the major reasons it is done is such that you will not have this disorder occurring in terms of goiter. So iodine, very important for the prevention of goiter. So growth hormone, right? Very important as well. If this is growth hormone secretion, it is controlled by hypothalamic factors and a negative feedback loop. Growth hormone stimulates growth in cooperation with IGF-1 and independently increases glucose and fatty acid availability to fuel tissue growth and repair. So I have a question for you. What hormone stimulates growth hormone secretion? IGF-1, SRIF, or growth hormone GHRH? And the answer, of course, is GHRH, most critically, as it relates to that. So growth hormone stimulates growth. Insulin-like growth factor, which is IGF, stimulates IGF-1 production in bone, muscle, and other soft tissues. And IGF-1 stimulates cell growth and cell division in these same tissues. Growth hormone also stimulates fat breakdown and gluconeogenesis. Its metabolic effect is completely independent of IGF. That's very important to take note of. So here we are seeing growth hormone disorders. And here we are seeing in terms of what could happen if you are looking at, in these two instances here, in this first situation or first instance shown here, 5.5-year-old boy with growth hormone deficiency, which is shown on the left, is considered shorter and chubbier than his fraternal sister, who is on the right. A man on this side here with gigantism alongside his identical twin, right? And the only difference, it has been associated with the abnormal growth hormone that is secreted. So question, why does growth hormone deficiency cause chubbiness? All right? And very simply, because growth hormone stimulates fat breakdown, all right? So once the fat is constantly being broken down, you will have it being layered because the body is thinking it's going into a state of starvation. All right, so almost there in terms of regulation. Last thing we'd speak to, regulation of blood calcium. So PTH, parathyroid hormone, increases blood calcium levels by stimulating bone breakdown and inhibiting bone deposition, stimulating vitamin D activation and increasing calcium retention by the kidneys. And this is shown here in terms of calcium metabolism. And here we see in this whole process that it is corrected once it is seen or once it is detected that the calcium levels are decreased. What you will have or reduce, you will have mechanism being set in place that will ultimately lead to increased blood calcium levels, and therefore the deficit is now corrected. All right, so both PTH and vitamin D3 increase the calcium concentration in the bloods. So the final question I would have for you is, PTH increases the concentration of calcium in urine. Is that true or false? And the answer will be false. All right, so it has been my distinct pleasure in terms of presenting this presentation to you. Hope it was as enjoyable for you as well. So do have a good one, and I'll see you in the next presentation. Okay, goodbye.